What is a beautiful deleveraging and how can it be achieved? This question might seem complex, but it's actually quite simple when broken down into understandable terms. Imagine the central bank with its power to print money, but only buy financial assets. Contrast this with the central government that can buy goods and services and put money directly into the hands of people, yet it can't print money. For a healthy economy, these two entities must work hand in hand. Output. Picture the central bank buying government bonds, essentially lending money to the government. This allows the government to run a deficit, increase spending on goods and services through programs and benefits. This action increases people's income and the government's debt, but interestingly, it lowers the economy's total debt burden. Now envision a tightrope walker representing our policymakers. They must delicately balance the four ways that debt burdens are reduced. They need to ensure that deflationary methods are in harmony with the inflationary ones to maintain stability. If balanced correctly, this can result in a beautiful deleveraging. So what makes a deleveraging beautiful? It's handling a difficult situation in the best possible way, more beautiful than the debt-fueled, unbalanced excesses of the leveraging phase. In a beautiful deleveraging, debts decline relative to income, real economic growth is positive, and inflation isn't a problem. It is all about having the right balance. Achieving this balance requires a mix of cutting spending, reducing debt, transferring wealth, and printing money, all while maintaining economic and social stability. A common concern is whether printing money will raise inflation. However, it won't if it offsets falling credit. Remember, spending is what matters here. A dollar of spending paid for with money has the same effect on price as a dollar of spending paid for with credit. To initiate a turnaround, the central bank must not only stimulate income growth, but also get the rate of income growth higher than the interest rate on the accumulated debt. This simply means that income must grow faster than debt. But be warned, printing money can easily be abused. It's tempting because it's so easy to do and people prefer it to the alternatives. The trick is to avoid printing too much money and causing unacceptably high inflation. If policymakers achieve the right balance, a deleveraging isn't so dramatic. Growth is slow, but debt burdens go down. That's a beautiful deleveraging. As incomes begin to rise, borrowers appear more creditworthy. Lenders begin to lend money again, debt burdens start to fall. With access to borrowed money, people can spend more, and gradually the economy begins to grow again, leading to the reflation phase of the long-term debt cycle. This is the essence of a beautiful deleveraging.
Have you ever pondered the intricate relationship between debt and productivity? It's a delicate balance, a dance if you will, between managing what you owe and what you produce. Imagine your financial standing as a boat. Debt is the water that threatens to sink your vessel, while productivity is the force that keeps it afloat. Mastering the art of debt management is akin to navigating stormy seas, ensuring your boat doesn't capsize under the weight of the water. Now, imagine the economy as a much larger vessel, carrying the collective debt and productivity of a nation. The balance is even more crucial, and the stakes significantly higher. Debt, in simple terms, is what you owe. It can be a useful tool like wind in your sails, propelling you forward. But if debt rises faster than income, it's like a rogue wave hitting your boat, threatening to tip it over. The key to good debt management is ensuring your debt never outpaces your income. Productivity, on the other hand, is what you produce. It's the force that keeps your boat moving, even against the current. However, if income rises faster than productivity, it's like trying to sail against the wind. You will eventually lose ground and become uncompetitive. Now, let's put these two concepts together. The process of reducing debt relative to income is called deleveraging. If not handled well, it can be like a storm, wreaking havoc on your boat. But if managed properly, it can gradually lighten the load, helping your boat sail smoother and faster. This process takes time, often a decade or more, hence the term lost decade. Overlay this concept of the short-term debt cycle on top of the long-term debt cycle, and then lay both of them on the productivity growth line. This provides a template, a navigational chart if you will, for understanding not just where you've been or where you are, but also where you're likely headed. The takeaway from this journey is threefold. First, ensure that debt doesn't rise faster than income, to avoid a crushing debt burden. Second, keep income from rising faster than productivity, to maintain competitiveness. And third, strive to increase productivity. In the long run, it's the wind in your sails, the primary force propelling you forward. This advice may seem straightforward, but it's surprising how many people, including policymakers, tend to overlook it. Yet, it's a proven template, a chart that has guided many through the rough seas of financial management. And with hope, it can guide you too. In conclusion, mastering the art of debt management and productivity is like learning to navigate stormy seas. It's a delicate balance, a dance between what you owe and what you produce. But with the right tools and understanding, you can keep your vessel afloat and sail towards a brighter financial future. Thank you.
Have you ever wondered how depression affects wealth? Or perhaps how debt restructuring might play a role in this complex dynamic? Well, today we're delving into these intriguing concepts. Imagine walking into a bar and ordering a beer. You promise to pay later and place it on a tab. This promise of payment becomes an asset to the bartender. But what happens when you fail to keep that promise? This asset essentially becomes worthless. This is a simplified version of what happens during a depression. People discover that their perceived wealth isn't actually there. In such situations, many lenders agree to a process called debt restructuring. This is where the initial agreement is altered to allow borrowers to pay back less over a longer time frame or at a lower interest rate. Why? Because lenders would rather receive a little of something than all of nothing. However, debt restructuring is not without its pitfalls. While it reduces debt, it also causes income and asset values to decrease at an even faster rate. This results in a worsening debt burden. It's a painful and deflationary process. These changes also impact the central government. Lower incomes and less employment mean less tax revenue, yet the government needs to increase spending due to rising unemployment and the need for financial support and stimulus plans. This leads to exploding budget deficits. Essentially, the government spends more than it earns in taxes. To fund these deficits, governments are left with two choices: raise taxes or borrow money. But with falling incomes and rising unemployment, where will the money come from? The answer is the wealthy. As wealth is heavily concentrated within a small percentage of the population, governments naturally raise taxes on the wealthy, leading to a redistribution of wealth. However, this redistribution can lead to resentment and social disorder. The wealthy, squeezed by a weak economy and higher taxes, begin to resent the have-nots. If the depression continues, tensions can rise, not just within countries, but also between debtor and creditor nations. This pressure can lead to political changes, sometimes extreme. The 1930s provide a stark example of this. The Depression led to the rise of Hitler, war in Europe, and further depression in the United States. Under pressure to end the depression, central banks, who have the power to print money, are forced into action. When credit disappears and people are desperate for money, central banks lower interest rates to nearly zero and begin printing money. Unlike spending cuts, debt reduction, and wealth redistribution, printing money is inflationary and stimulative. The central bank prints new money and uses it to buy financial assets and government bonds. It's a strategy that was used in the United States during the Great Depression and again in 2008, when the Federal Reserve printed over $2 trillion. In conclusion, depression, debt, and wealth are intricately linked. Debt restructuring plays a significant role in this dynamic, impacting lenders, borrowers, and governments alike. The redistribution of wealth and the printing of money by central banks are key strategies in managing these complex relationships. But remember, these strategies come with their own sets of challenges and repercussions.
Ever pondered why economies take a nosedive? Take a moment and think back to Japan in 1989 or the United States in 1929. What caused these economies to crash and burn? The simple answer is deleveraging. Now you might wonder, what's that? Well, deleveraging is when people cut back on spending. And when that happens, incomes fall, credit disappears, asset prices drop, banks find themselves in a tight spot, the stock market crashes, social tensions rise, and the whole thing starts to spiral downwards. It's like a domino effect, where one thing leads to another in a vicious cycle. As incomes fall and debt repayments rise, borrowers find themselves in a pinch. No longer deemed creditworthy, they can no longer borrow enough money to make their debt repayments. They scramble to sell assets, which floods the market. This is when the stock market collapses, the real estate market tanks, and banks find themselves in hot water. As asset prices drop, the value of the collateral borrowers can put up drops. This makes borrowers even less creditworthy. People start to feel poor. Credit rapidly disappears. It's a vicious cycle of less spending, less income, less wealth, less credit, and so on. This might sound similar to a recession, but there's a key difference. In a recession, lowering interest rates can stimulate borrowing. However, in a deleveraging, lowering interest rates doesn't work because interest rates are already low and soon hit 0%. So the stimulation ends. In a deleveraging, borrowers' debt burdens have simply gotten too big and can't be relieved by lowering interest rates. Lenders realize that debts have become too large to ever be fully paid back. Borrowers have lost their ability to repay and their collateral has lost value. They feel crippled by the debt. Lenders stop lending. Borrowers stop borrowing. So, how do we tackle a deleveraging? The problem is debt burdens are too high and they must come down. There are 4 ways this can happen. People, businesses, and governments cut their spending. Debts are reduced through defaults and restructurings. Wealth is redistributed from the haves to the have-nots. And finally, the central bank prints new money. Usually, spending is cut first. As we've seen, people, businesses, banks, and even governments tighten their belts and cut their spending so that they can pay down their debt. This is often referred to as austerity. When borrowers stop taking on new debts and start paying down old debts, you might expect the debt burden to decrease. But the opposite happens. Because spending is cut and one person's spending is another person's income, it causes incomes to fall. They fall faster than debts are repaid, and the debt burden actually gets worse. This leads to the next step. Debts must be reduced. Many borrowers find themselves unable to repay their loans, which are a lender's assets. When borrowers don't repay the bank, people get nervous that the bank won't be able to repay them, so they rush to withdraw their money from the bank. Banks get squeezed, and people, businesses, and banks default on their debts. This severe economic contraction is a depression. So, the next time you wonder why economies crash, remember, it's all about deleveraging. It's a domino effect that starts with reduced spending and ends with a depression. It's a complex process, but understanding it can help us navigate these turbulent financial waters.
Have you ever wondered why the cost of your favorite coffee keeps rising, or why the value of money seems to change over time? These fluctuations, my friends, are due to a phenomenon known as inflation. Inflation, in its most basic form, is the rate at which the general level of prices for goods and services is rising. Picture it as an invisible hand that gradually pushes up the price tag on your weekly grocery haul or the monthly rent for your apartment. But why does this happen? Well, it's a classic case of supply and demand. When there's more money circulating in the economy than there are goods and services available, prices rise to balance things out. This is inflation in action. But what happens when the opposite occurs? When prices fall, we enter the realm of deflation. This might sound like a bargain hunter's dream come true, but it's not as beneficial as it might seem. Deflation often leads to reduced economic activity. With prices falling, people and businesses may hold off on spending and investment, expecting that they'll get a better deal in the future. This can create a vicious cycle of decreased spending and further price drops, potentially leading to a recession. Now you might be wondering, who's in charge of managing these economic forces? Enter the central bank. The central bank acts as the economy's watchguard, monitoring inflation and deflation and implementing policies to keep them in check. If inflation is too high, the central bank can increase interest rates. This makes borrowing money more expensive, which discourages excessive spending and slows down economic activity. On the other hand, if deflation is looming, the central bank can lower interest rates to stimulate spending and borrowing, thus encouraging economic growth. In essence, the central bank is like a skilled conductor, orchestrating the economy's symphony, with inflation and deflation as its main instruments. It strives to maintain a delicate balance, ensuring the economy doesn't play too loudly inflation, or too softly, deflation. To wrap things up, inflation is the rise in prices over time, while deflation is the reduction in prices. Both are influenced by the balance of money and goods in the economy. The central bank plays a pivotal role in managing these forces, using interest rates as its primary tool to control spending and borrowing, thus maintaining economic stability. So the next time you notice a change in the price of your favorite coffee, you'll know that it's not just about beans and baristas. It's about the economy as a whole, the balance of supply and demand, and the watchful eye of the central bank. Understanding these concepts can help us navigate our financial decisions and appreciate the intricate symphony that is our economy.
If we follow the transactions and play this out, we see a progression like the productivity growth line, but because we borrow, we have cycles. This isn't due to any laws or regulation, it's due to human nature and the way that credit works. Think of borrowing as simply a way of pulling spending forward. In order to buy something you can't afford, you need to spend more than you make. To do this, you essentially need to borrow from your future self. In doing so, you create a time in the future that you need to spend less than you make in order to pay it back. It very quickly resembles a cycle. Basically, anytime you borrow, you create a cycle. This is as true for an individual as it is for the economy. This is why understanding credit is so important, because it sets into motion a mechanical, predictable series of events that will happen in the future. This makes credit different from money. Money is what you settle transactions with. When you buy a beer from a bartender with cash, the transaction is settled immediately. But when you buy a beer with credit, it's like starting a bar tab. You're saying you promise to pay in the future. Together, you and the bartender create an asset and a liability. You just created credit out of thin air. It's not until you pay the bar tab later that the asset and liability disappear, the debt goes away, and the transaction is settled. The reality is that most of what people call money is actually credit. The total amount of credit in the United States is about $50 trillion, and the total amount of money is only about $3 trillion. Remember, in an economy without credit, the only way to increase your spending is to produce more. But in an economy with credit, you can also increase your spending by borrowing. As a result, an economy with credit has more spending and allows incomes to rise faster than productivity over the short run, but not over the long run. Now, don't get me wrong, credit isn't necessarily something bad that just causes cycles. It's bad when it finances overconsumption that can't be paid back. However, it's good when it efficiently allocates resources and produces income so you can pay back the debt. For example, if you borrow money to buy a big TV, it doesn't generate income for you to pay back the debt. But if you borrow money to buy a tractor, and that tractor lets you harvest more crops and earn more money, then you can pay back your debt and improve your living standards. In an economy with credit, we can follow the transactions and see how credit creates growth. Let me give you an example. Suppose you earn $100,000 a year and have no debt. You are creditworthy enough to borrow $10,000, say on a credit card, so you can spend $110,000 even though you only earn $100,000. Since your spending is another person's income, someone is earning $110,000. The person earning $110,000 with no debt can borrow $11,000 so he can spend $121,000 even though he has only earned $110,000. His spending is another person's income, and by following the transactions, we can begin to see how this process works in a self-reinforcing pattern. But remember, borrowing creates cycles, and if the cycle goes up, it eventually needs to come down. This leads us into the short-term debt cycle. As economic activity increases, we see an expansion, the first phase of the short-term debt cycle. Spending continues to increase and prices start to rise. This happens because the increase in spending is fueled by credit.
Is the economy a complex behemoth beyond the comprehension of mere mortals? Or is it a simple mechanical entity operating on a set of straightforward principles? Well, it's not as complicated as you might think. Picture the economy as a machine. Yes, a machine. Not an insurmountable enigma, but something that functions according to basic, understandable principles. It's made up of a few simple parts and a myriad of transactions that are repeated countless times. These transactions, driven by human nature, create three main forces that drive the economy. 1. Productivity growth. 2. The short-term debt cycle. And 3. The long-term debt cycle. By understanding these three forces and how they interact, we can create a template for tracking economic movements and figuring out what's happening in the economy at any given moment. So where do we begin? With the simplest part of the economy, transactions. An economy is merely the sum of the transactions that make it up. Every time you buy something, you create a transaction. Each transaction consists of a buyer exchanging money or credit with a seller for goods, services, or financial assets. Credit spends just like money. By adding together the money spent and the amount of credit spent, we can determine the total spending. This total spending is what drives the economy. And if you divide the amount spent by the quantity sold, you get the price. That's a transaction. It's the building block of the economic machine. All cycles and all forces in an economy are driven by transactions. So understanding transactions means understanding the whole economy. A market consists of all the buyers and all the sellers making transactions for the same thing. An economy consists of all of the transactions in all of its markets. People, businesses, banks, and governments all engage in transactions, exchanging money and credit for goods, services, and financial assets. Among these players, the government holds a unique position consisting of two important parts: a central government that collects taxes and spends money, and a central bank, which controls the amount of money and credit in the economy by influencing interest rates and printing new money. Now, pay close attention to credit. It's the most important part of the economy and probably the least understood. It's the most important part because it's the biggest and most volatile. Lenders and borrowers also go to the market to make transactions. Lenders want to turn their money into more money, and borrowers usually want to buy something they can't afford or invest in something, like starting a business. Credit can help both lenders and borrowers get what they want. The borrowers promise to repay the amount they borrow, and this promise becomes an asset to the lenders. So there you have it. The economy is not as complex as it seems. It's a machine made up of simple parts and driven by transactions. By understanding these transactions and the forces they create, we can understand the economy and navigate it effectively.